Okay, so it is now time for me to put all the stuff I've shown you into practice. And in this chapter, what I'm going to do is actually start modeling out my scene based on the initial block out that I did. So what I'm going to show in the next 3 chapters is a time lapse of me modeling out the environment using Cecil's concept art as reference. And just to warn you, the next 3 chapters are pretty long because I'm going to show you a time lapse of my entire modeling process. So let's go ahead and get started. One more thing I would like to mention is because of the length of these chapters, I probably won't be talking as much as I have on previous chapters, but I will do my best to clue you in as to why I'm doing certain things and what I'm thinking. So with that out of the way, you may have noticed that I like to get started from the ground up. And you'll see with this first kind of trim piece that I made, I started by modeling out a curve. And with that curve, I snapped it to the grid as much as possible. And I know we talked about that before, but there's many reasons why you'll see me snapping so many edges and profiles to the grid. And it all really boils down to just making my job as easy as possible. And for me, if I am neat and clean and snap objects, I find that they will line up with textures better. It's easier to make a piece modular. Stuff ends up lining up better, and it's just overall a much cleaner way to work. So what I'm doing right now is creating a bunch of profiles, again by starting with curves. A lot of times I will bring a primitive into the scene and then use that primitive to snap points of the curve onto the primitive to get it more exact. So right here I'm drawing a profile, snapping the pivot to the top, and then we're just going to loft this to create a new trim. When I'm doing this, a lot of the times I'm thinking about how I'll potentially texture these pieces. And a trim like this, I'll have planned that it will eventually be a tileable piece, meaning the texture will tile. And since we're making all this to run on a game engine, we're limited by the amount of textures we can use and how much memory the system might have. So not every piece we make can be kind of a custom piece with its own texture page laid out like a character. A lot of pieces that I make are just tileable trim pieces that are good for kind of filling in the holes and using in creative ways. Reuse is good, especially in games. If this was something for a movie, we could probably make every single piece its own unique thing with its own unique texture. But since we are on a game engine, we're limited by the resources we have. Reuse is good, and so typically in any scene that I make, a good portion of it will just be tileable textures and tileable geometry pieces. And then maybe 20 to 25% of the scene might be actually, custom special one-off objects that have their own unique texture page. And I found for me that's a pretty good balance. I've tried in the past experimenting, trying to make a scene totally unique, every piece being unique, and I've always run into problems of finishing it on time and just getting everything to fit into memory depending on the system I've been working on. So like I said, I'll break a scene up into pieces that are tileable, pieces that can be reused, and it just is faster, and you'll have more time to spend on kind of those real special pieces that you want to be like your landmark pieces, or the things you really want someone to notice. But at the same time, every piece that I model right now, I might not know how I'll texture it in the end. I'm just kind of trying to make everything look cool and have the correct amount of resolution for, it being potentially a final in-game model. So what I'm trying to say here really is, as you're modeling, you need to take texturing into account. Not every piece has to be totally planned out, but if you get a good idea of what you can make into a tileable piece and what will end up being kind of your one-off beauty pieces, you'll find that at the end you won't have dug yourself a hole where you've modeled a whole scene and every single piece needs to be unique. So moral of the story is plan ahead. Think about texturing. Think about lighting. A lot of times when I'm doing the topology here, I'm thinking, okay, will this light well? Is there enough verts here to light if I want to do a lighting solution based solely on vertices? And as I mentioned earlier, I'm always referring to the concept even though it's not totally evident as you watch this. Usually I'll have it on a second monitor or even a printout of it and just refer to it all the time to make sure that I'm not going too far off the intended look. And you can see the tools I'm using. Right now I'm drawing out a curve. This one I'm not even really snapping to the grid, just trying to get the shapes in. It's almost like painting. And then after the fact I'll go in and snap it to whatever the closest grid point was. And once I have a shape I like, if I'm going to revolve this, I'll put the pivot point in an appropriate spot and then use the revolve function. There we go. Could I have made this out of just starting with cylinders? Probably. But I find working with curves is the most accurate. Plus it laid out a set of UVs for me. See right here I'm using the bridge tool and the extrude tools to add on to this section. And once I get this right, we'll go ahead and duplicate it and throw it to the other side so we don't have to do the same thing twice. And looking at Cecil's concept art, I'm not trying to match exactly what he drew. More, I'm just trying to get the general idea across. So you can see right there, something that I do all the time is I will build a curve off of another object just so that everything lines up perfectly and nothing is slammed. I really don't like to ever hide verts behind walls or anything like that. One, because it won't light very good, and two, I just feel it's kind of messy. But in one of the chapters coming up later, we'll go over cleaning up modeling. So I'm not trying to do a perfect modeling pass right now, but I'm trying to get it so that it looks good, has the right amount of polygons to look decent for game art. But as far as cleaning everything up, I will usually do that as a later pass. So this section is starting to look pretty interesting. I like some of the shapes that we're getting. I like how this wall curves behind the pillars and kind of frames them. And right now what I'm doing is I'm going to build a little molding piece or a trim piece on the bottom of this just so it looks a little bit neater when it matches up with these more squarish kind of electrical boxes underneath. And you'll notice that the way I'm building this piece was by creating a curve off the edge of the piece on top of it and then offsetting that curve and then doing some lofting. And now I'm duplicating the object and mirroring it just so that I have the same piece on the top and bottom. Which when I think about texturing, I know I'll just have to texture one of the pieces and be able to use it in two places. Right here I just kind of roughed out a curve, got a shape I wanted, and then later snapped it to the grid. Still messing with it, getting it to look right. And like we did with the base of this building, I'm going to loft it and kind of create what I think eventually will be tileable pieces. Use the cut polygon tool, just trimming them and then sewing them back together at 45-degree angles. And there we go, it's a nice little roof style piece. And in the concept there are a few light sources. So right now I'm modeling out one of those. Using a primitive sphere here, I'll go ahead and trim off the edges, snap it to the grid, cut off what I don't need, and kind of use this as kind of like a fluorescent bulb kind of housing. Right now the shape's a little bit too basic looking, so I'm going to double click on the edge here to select the loop, extrude those edges, kind of pull this out. Go ahead and bevel these edges, which you'll see me do quite a lot. Because beveling edges is a good way to make things look heavy and realistic. And I'm not saying that I don't use 90-degree edges. I do use 90-degree edges quite a bit, but I also will bevel a lot of edges too to kind of counteract the 90-degree edges that I do have. So you really need to have a good mix of the two. I mean, we can't afford to bevel every single edge in a scene just because the polygon count would probably be out of control. But if you can strategically choose where you use them, then your scene will just look a lot more realistic. And like I said earlier, it looks heavier. A piece that has beveled edges just lights so much better. There's more edges that can catch the lighting. It just appears to be more massive. Whereas something that's just completely made of 90-degree edges can sometimes appear to be paper thin in a way. So let's see, what I'm doing right now is building the top left portion of the building that's in the concept art, which is this kind of round tower looking thing. As I built this, I had a hard time kind of solidifying what was in the concept and knowing exactly what to make, so I took a few liberties and just made a shape that I thought was cool. You can see again I'm using the same technique where I'll extract a curve off the bottom edge of something, and then offset the curve, and then loft it. And since I started with this piece by stealing the curve from the piece above it, I know that it'll line up exactly with the piece on top, where I could have made this piece probably starting with a primitive cylinder and gotten pretty much the same look. Getting it to match up exactly with the piece on top, I would have had to manually, by hand, snap points. And it just wouldn't have been as clean as starting with a curve. So right now I'm filling in the bottom of this piece. I'm going to go ahead and use the split polygon tool to connect these edges, just to keep things as quads. Maya has a cleanup tool, which some of you might have used and be familiar with, but I find it doesn't keep things in nice, neat quads. It can get pretty close, but you'll end up with a lot of triangulated edges that you might not want. You'll see there how I only did the work on one half and then mirrored it, just to be efficient. Don't want to have to be redundant and do the same thing twice. So you got to think about that when you're making pieces. If you can do it on just half the object and then mirror it and weld it back together, do that. And here's a good example of keeping even more rounded pieces, cylindrical pieces on the grid. Obviously not every point can be on the grid, but we can keep the cross sections there. And like before, I drew out two curves, snapped them down, and then used the revolve tool to kind of make these, I don't know, I wouldn't call them pillars, more like kind of electrical coils. Go in and harden the edges. And by snapping their pivot point to the center of the object, they now fit perfectly with this kind of rounded silo-shaped thing I made. This is what I mean by staying on the grid. Since that first piece was on the grid, I was able to snap the pivot points of those pillars to the same kind of center point and then just revolve them around that cross section, and it worked out perfectly. Everything lined up. I didn't have to fiddle with it by hand. It's just all mathematical and nice. Now moving on to this next section, what I'm doing right now is just kind of adjusting the position of this, making sure that it sits nice next to the pieces I created. I am slamming some geometry, meaning some of the verts are penetrating into the other faces, but we can clean that up later. Here we go with our curves again. I'm going to make another tileable piece right now. And have that kind of, after we snap these two grid points, make it nice and neat. We'll use this for kind of a trim piece for the top of our building. And again, planning for texturing, that will eventually be a tileable piece, which can be reused all over the place. And I hope it makes sense that the original block out that I did is really helping me right now with where things are going to go. And all I really have to determine at this point is the look of everything, instead of figuring out where it still has to sit, since we did that in the blockout phase. And sometimes I'll even use the geometry that I started with in the blockout phase as a starting point for creating, higher polygon parts. You might get sick of seeing this kind of building with curves, but believe me, this is the way to go in Maya. And this time I'm going to take this curve and snap the pivot point to the center of this other object that I want it to line up to, and then revolve it so that it matches up. And so we use this curve to make a nice, neat, curved ring. You'll see sometimes after I revolve a piece or loft a piece, I'll have to go in and reverse the faces. And that happens because I probably drew the curve clockwise when it needed to have been drawn counterclockwise or something like that. Also, curves have a different direction, a start of the curve and an end of the curve. And based on how the orientation of the curves are, sometimes the faces need to be flipped. And I don't really worry about getting it right as I draw the curve. I more just artistically want to kind of figure out my shapes. It's easy enough to reverse them later. What I've done is I've created a hotkey for toggling back face, and hitting that will show me if something that I recently lofted or revolved needs to be reversed. But it's definitely something to keep your eye out for if you model with curves, is making sure that the face orientation is correct. So I've made an object here, filled in the holes. This object, like so many others, was started with a curve, and now I'm copying the curve and offsetting the curve, and using that offset to create a loft, and then welding it all together and filling in the holes. Hardening these edges here so that we have a nice kind of beveled sci-fi look, and then filling it in and using the split polygon tool to add some more details. And now, after extruding that face in and snapping these edges down to the lower trim by holding down V to snap it to the edges, we have a pretty interesting shape. And keep in mind that right now all I'm trying to do is come up with what could potentially be my low poly geometry. For example, I might plan that the vertical box to the left here might eventually be some kind of computer terminal or something like that. But that will really become clear once we do the final texturing that will sit on top of this game model. Once we do the final texturing for this, and it has all the normal mapping and specular mapping and stuff like that, then it'll really become clear what it is. But until then, I'm just worried about getting the silhouette right and making it something that I can texture later. I mean, I really want to make the modeling look as good as possible, but at the same time, I don't want to put too much detail into the modeling when I can achieve better detail through texturing later. So it's a fine line of determining kind of that minimum amount of polygon you need and planning for what you can achieve later with texturing. For example, going back to that kind of vertical box, if I was to go in and start modeling out all the dials and do it all through polygons, my scene would just be too expensive, where I could get the exact same look through a nice normal map and a good diffuse texture. Okay, so the piece I'm building right now is one of the few curvy looking pieces in the concept. A lot of this concept is very science fiction, very blocky, 90-degree angles. But this piece in particular looked kind of like an intake vent, some kind of air fan system, something like that. And again, I'm building this using curves, converting curves, starting out with a EP curve and then converting it to a CV curve to kind of smooth it out, and then lofting the curves and offsetting the curves to get kind of precise offset bevels. You can see right there I'm using the CV curve just to kind of smooth it out, and then convert back to the EP curve and doing some lofting, trying to clean it up. For curvy pieces like this, I don't really have an exact science. I just kind of mess with it. I know usually in my head what I want it to look like, or how I want the tessellation to be and the layout of the verts and edges. But sometimes when you're working with curves, you got to play with it a little bit to get it to look neat and orderly, I guess. And maybe it's not apparent watching the time lapse, but I kind of struggled with this piece a little bit. Like I said earlier, I knew in my head how I wanted it to look in low poly form, but I just couldn't get it right. But sometimes you just have to show the polygons who's boss. And so eventually I did get it to look the way I wanted. It just took a little bit of messing around, a little bit of offsetting more curves, duplicating more curves. I think I elaborated a little bit from what was in the concept art. But sometimes that's how it goes, and not everything's a perfectly smooth process from beginning to end. Sometimes you just have to kind of strong arm things and just make them work. And I just dropped a plane in there to fill in that backside. We'll go ahead and clean that up in another chapter, but I just wanted to put that in to kind of figure out where I wanted the wall. What I'm doing right here is extruding a bunch of faces, but in the channel box I turned the keep faces together option off. And so this way I can do a bunch of extrusions all at once and make them pretty uniform. I would hate to have to do this 20 different times, and you probably wouldn't get it to look all the same. So just kind of pulling those edges in, creating this vent type system. And so now that I have that vent area kind of blocked in, I'm going to clean up some of the area to the left of it and take this box, put it into a group, and we're just going to duplicate it and put it over here. Remember, reuse is really important in making games. We don't have time to make a million different pieces, and I felt that piece was kind of interesting. Once it has textures on it and it's totally detailed, it'll be a nice eye-level piece of eye candy. So right now I'm moving on to another area near the top of the scene. This is something that looked like some kind of crane, maybe some sci-fi anti-gravity kind of thing. With this piece, like I do with a lot of other pieces, I started with just a primitive cylinder. I like to do that because we already have a piece that's perfectly round and mathematical. Start with a cylinder, I can tell it how many sides I want it to have. And I'll usually keep to a number of sides such as 16, 8, 24, 32, because those correspond with texture sizes and our grid. And hopefully you recognize a lot of the modeling tools that I'm using. Using the cut faces tool a lot. Extruding off edges, faces, snapping points. Deleting those faces there. Then we'll go ahead and extrude these edges. Snap them and weld the verts. And just keep kind of messing around with this piece until it looks right. Sometimes as I'm modeling, I don't know what's going to look right, but I model in a way that, it's just kind of like sketching. Just keep to the big shapes. Keep it pretty clean. Modeling cleanly is very important. You don't want random edges lying around. You don't want things to be unsewn. I never want to have tessellation that's not giving me anything. So right now I'm working on this little detail that I see in the concept art. I don't know exactly what this is, but I'm just trying to make it look cool. Again, I started with a basic cylinder, and from there put some cuts in it, extruded some of the faces, did some beveling. Go ahead and soften those edges right there. And I think now we're getting at something that looks pretty interesting. The top of this is still a little bit blocky, so I'm going to sew it together into one piece. Double click to select those edge loops, and let's bevel these just to make this look more heavy. There we go. So moving on, working on the piece to the left-hand side of that crane thing we just made. I think with this piece I actually started with one of the pieces of geometry that I made for the mock-up and just kind of cleaned it up, snapped some of the pieces to the grid. And now creating some curves, offsetting some curves, we're just going to make a nice horizontal detail. Artistically, you never want to have a straight line that goes on forever. So making a little detail piece like this will help kind of break up this really long vertical line. So I can make this thing, snap it to the grid, make it a little bit thicker, and let's hit Shift D to duplicate it. And now I'm just trying to find where these pieces sit so they'll look nice and even. That kind of works. Adjust them a little bit more. That piece that we just worked on could also potentially be a very nice tileable texture. Like I've mentioned a few times, it's really good to plan out while we're modeling how we'll texture things. So if you see something that's very horizontal or vertical and could be made into a tileable texture and reused somewhere else in the scene, that's the kind of things we need to do for game art, because again, we're limited on resources. Now, if you remember all the way back to the first chapter, one of the things I highlighted that I really liked about the concept art was this horizontal row of kind of liquid containers, and that's the section I'm working on right now. And this is one of the pieces I really want to nail. It's at eye level for the player. I feel like it could be very interesting. So I'm going to end up spending a lot of time in this area trying to get it to look as good as it can. Not every area can be a total masterpiece, but this section here, because it's inherently, I think, just very interesting, and it's at eye level with the player, and in the concept was one of the most noticeable things, we really want to nail this. Also, since this area is lower to the ground and probably will be at eye level to the player, I'll probably put a few more polygons in here than I would, for example, higher up, where we'll never get close to. So I'm stealing some of the details from other paneling that I've made, and we'll just reuse them here in this panel as well. Although eventually I'll delete those from the scene. They're too high of a poly count to actually put in the final in-game geometry. So I'm just leaving them in there to remind me of, kind of what I want to do when I texture this thing. I can easily get the same result with a normal map later on, not have to, waste the memory and performance of having all those polygons.